Number 1. Cary Stayner. There are places in the world that feel untouchable. Vast forests, granite cliffs, open skies stretching over valleys carved by time. Yosemite National Park is one of those places, a landscape people associate with beauty, freedom, and escape. In 1999, that illusion shattered, because in the middle of one of America's most iconic national parks, a quiet handyman was hunting. Cary Stayner did not look like a monster. He was a maintenance worker at the Cedar Lodge, located just outside Yosemite. He fixed things, cleaned rooms, blended in. Guests saw him as part of the background, someone who made beds and repaired fixtures while families prepared for hiking trips and sightseeing. Behind that ordinary exterior was a man carrying years of psychological damage and violent fantasies. Cary Stayner's life had already been marked by trauma long before 1999. In 1972, when Cary was 11 years old, his younger brother, Stephen Stayner, was kidnapped by a child molester and held captive for 7 years. The case became nationally known when Stephen heroically escaped in 1980, rescuing another kidnapped boy in the process. Stephen was hailed as a survivor, later the subject of media coverage in a television film. The Stayner family was thrust into the spotlight. Cary, the older brother, grew up in the shadow of that tragedy and the attention surrounding it. Friends later described him as withdrawn and socially awkward. He reportedly harbored resentment and struggled with feelings of invisibility. None of that excuses what he would do, but it paints the backdrop for the violence that would follow. In February 1999, 3 visitors checked into the Cedar Lodge: Carol Sund, her daughter Julie Sund, and Julie's friend Silvina Palazzo. They were tourists, enjoying a trip to Yosemite. The park was in its winter season, quieter, less crowded, more isolated. At some point during their stay, Cary Stayner made his move. He abducted the 3 women from their room. The details are grim and methodical. He bound them. He controlled them. Investigators later determined that he strangled Carol Sund first. He then murdered the 2 teenagers. After killing them, he disposed of their bodies in separate locations in and around the Yosemite area. Carol Sund's body was found near the park entrance, burned inside the trunk of a vehicle. The 2 girls' bodies were discovered weeks later, hidden near a remote area. The murders shocked the nation. Yosemite, a place associated with peace, had become the site of calculated brutality. Authorities launched an intensive manhunt. The FBI joined local and state law enforcement. Roadblocks were set up. Tips poured in. Suspicion circled around lodge employees and local residents. Fear spread quickly through a region that relied heavily on tourism. But Cary Stayner wasn't done. In July 1999, just months after the triple homicide, 26-year-old Joy Ruth Armstrong, an employee at Yosemite's Natural History Association, was reported missing. Armstrong was a biologist who had been living in a cabin in the park. She was independent, familiar with the wilderness, and deeply connected to the environment she studied. Stayner broke into her cabin. He strangled her. After killing Armstrong, he decapitated her body. The act of beheading adds a layer of horror that goes beyond murder. It is deliberate, intimate, and symbolically violent. It requires time. It requires physical proximity. It is not impulsive. When Armstrong's body was discovered, the brutality was undeniable. Investigators intensified their focus on park employees and those with access to the area. Stayner, as a handyman with knowledge of the terrain and guest patterns, fit the profile. During questioning, he eventually confessed, not only to Armstrong's murder, but to the earlier killings of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Palazzo. He described the crimes with chilling detachment. Stayner told investigators that he had fantasized about killing women for years. He claimed that seeing coverage of other serial killers had sparked something in him. He spoke of feeling compelled, of struggling with violent sexual fantasies. He admitted that he targeted the women because of opportunity and access. As a lodge employee, he knew which rooms were occupied. He knew when guests were isolated. He understood the rhythms of the property. Trust was his weapon. Guests at a lodge assume staff are there to help them, to provide towels, to fix broken locks. They do not imagine that the man carrying tools down the hallway is studying them, calculating vulnerability. During his trial, the prosecution laid out the brutality of the murders, the strangulation of 3 women in one incident, the burning of a body, the decapitation of another victim months later, the calculated use of his employment to gain proximity. The defense did not deny the killings. Instead, they focused on Stainer's mental state, presenting evidence of his troubled upbringing and psychological issues. But the jury saw the pattern: 4 women murdered within months. A lodge handyman who turned his access into a hunting ground. In 2002, Cary Stainer was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death in California State Court. As of today, he remains on death row, housed at San Quentin State Prison. The Yosemite murders changed how people perceived the park. It forced visitors to confront the idea that danger does not only lurk in cities or dark alleys. It can exist in places marketed as sanctuaries. It can wear a uniform. It can carry a toolbox. Stainer's case is also disturbing because of the contrast between his brother's story and his own. Stephen Stainer survived unimaginable abuse and later became known for rescuing another child from captivity. Cary Stainer, by contrast, became a predator. 2 brothers. 2 vastly different paths shaped by trauma. One associated with survival, the other with calculated violence. What makes Cary Stainer's crimes especially haunting is the methodical nature of them. Strangulation is intimate. It requires sustained pressure, eye contact, physical closeness. It is not distant, it is personal. Beheading adds an element of post-mortem degradation that goes beyond killing. It signals a desire to dominate completely. He did not lash out randomly in public, he chose isolated victims. He chose controlled environments. He used his job to identify targets. He moved bodies to delay discovery. These were not chaotic acts. They were deliberate. In interviews after his arrest, Stainer attempted to explain his actions through references to fantasy and internal compulsion. But explanations do not erase what happened in those lodge rooms and cabins. 4 women entered Yosemite seeking adventure or work. None of them left alive. The granite cliffs of Yosemite still stand. The waterfalls still draw crowds. Tourists still hike its trails. But the name Cary Stainer remains attached to that landscape like a stain. A reminder that even in the most beautiful places, human brutality can intrude. He was not a stranger lurking in the woods. He was the handyman who knew the layout, the employee who had keys, the man guests likely passed in hallways without a second thought. And that is what makes the story so unsettling. The killer wasn't hiding in the wilderness. He was already inside. Number 2, Ricardo Medina Jr. There are crimes that shock because of their brutality. And then there are crimes that shock because of who commits them. When the headline first broke, it felt surreal. A former children's television hero arrested for killing his roommate with a sword. Not a gun, not a knife, a sword. Ricardo Medina Jr. was once part of a franchise that defined childhood for millions. In the early 2000s, he portrayed the Red Ranger in Power Rangers Wild Force, a show built on bright costumes, teamwork, and clear moral lines between good and evil. Later, he appeared in Power Rangers Samurai. To fans, he was a masked defender of justice, battling monsters in stylized fight scenes and delivering scripted heroism. Off-camera, in January 2015, the story was very different. Medina was living in Green Valley, California, sharing a home with a roommate named Joshua Sutter. Reports indicate that tensions had been building between the 2 men. Disagreements over Medina's girlfriend and household dynamics had escalated. On January 31, 2015, an argument broke out. According to Medina's later account, the confrontation became physical. He claimed that Sutter forced his way into Medina's bedroom after an argument, leading to a struggle. Inside that room was a weapon that would transform a dispute into a fatal act, a decorative sword described as being in the style of Conan the Barbarian. During the altercation, Medina grabbed the sword. He stabbed Sutter once in the abdomen. It was a single thrust, but it was devastating. A blade designed for display or fantasy combat pierced real flesh. Sutter staggered out of the room and collapsed. Emergency responders were called, but the wound was catastrophic. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The image is jarring. A former Red Ranger standing in a bedroom holding a sword as his roommate bleeds to death in the hallway. It feels cinematic, but there was no director yelling cut, no stunt choreography, no special effects. Medina was arrested on suspicion of murder. Initially, he was released while investigators continued reviewing evidence. The case drew intense media attention, fueled largely by his past role in a globally recognized franchise. The contrast was unavoidable. A man once marketed as a hero now faced allegations of lethal violence. In 2016, Medina was formally charged with murder. The prosecution's position was straightforward, an argument escalated, and he responded with deadly force. The defense maintained that he acted in self-defense, claiming Sutter had forced his way into the bedroom and attacked him. Legal battles continued for months. Eventually, in 2017, Medina accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty not to murder, but to voluntary manslaughter. The plea acknowledged that he had intentionally killed Sutter in the heat of the moment, without premeditation, but also without lawful justification for deadly force. He was sentenced to 6 years in state prison. For someone facing a possible life sentence if convicted of murder, the plea deal significantly reduced his exposure. But 6 years in prison is still a profound fall from public recognition and convention appearances to confinement and a criminal record. Medina served time within the California prison system, reportedly including incarceration at facilities that handle serious offenders. His case became another example of how rapidly a public image can collapse. One violent decision erased years of television fame. The brutality of the act lies not in multiple wounds or prolonged torture, but in the starkness of it. A heated argument, a blade within reach, a split-second decision. The weapon itself amplifies the horror. A sword is not subtle. It is long, heavy, designed to cut deeply. It carries historical imagery of warfare and combat. In a modern suburban home, it becomes something surreal and terrifying. There is also a psychological dimension to the public's reaction. For many, Power Rangers was not just a show. It was part of childhood. Costumes, action figures, after-school episodes where problems were solved with teamwork and clear moral resolution. Seeing one of those actors tied to a real killing disrupted that nostalgia. It forced fans to separate character from actor in the harshest possible way. Unlike career criminals who build reputations through repeated offenses, Medina's case appears to center on a single lethal event. There was no pattern of serial violence, no criminal enterprise. But that single event was enough to permanently alter his identity in the public eye. Court documents and reports indicate that after stabbing Sutter, Medina called 911 and waited for authorities to arrive. That detail often surfaces in discussions of intent and panic. It suggests that whatever happened in that room was not followed by an attempt to flee or conceal the crime. But the law does not measure morality by what happens after the blade is withdrawn. It measures the act itself. A man was dead. The plea to voluntary manslaughter acknowledges that Medina intentionally used deadly force during a sudden quarrel. It stops short of labeling him a premeditated murderer, but it does not excuse the killing. The court sentenced him accordingly. He was released from prison in 2020 after serving part of his sentence, accounting for credits and time served. Since then, he has largely stayed out of public attention. There has been no major return to mainstream acting. The industry that once cast him as a brightly colored hero has kept its distance. What makes this case haunting is the collision of fantasy and reality. On television, sword fights are choreographed. The hero swings and the villain falls harmlessly onto padded mats. In Medina's living room, there were no stunt doubles. The blade met flesh. The consequence was irreversible. There is a tendency in pop culture to blur the line between actors and the characters they portray. Children see a masked hero and believe, at least briefly, that the person underneath shares those virtues. But actors are not their roles. They are human, capable of the same anger, fear, and poor decisions as anyone else. In this case, that humanity turned violent. The fall of Ricardo Medina Jr. is not the story of a long-hidden criminal mastermind. It is the story of escalation, of an argument that crossed into physical confrontation. of a weapon close enough to grab, of a single, fatal decision. And that is what makes it so disturbing. Not an elaborate scheme, not a calculated spree, just a moment where anger and access to a deadly weapon intersected. For fans who once watched him morph into a superhero, the reality is stark. There was no transformation sequence this time, no triumphant music, just flashing police lights, court hearings, and a prison sentence. The Red Ranger once symbolized courage and leadership on screen. In real life, Ricardo Medina Jr.'s name is now permanently attached to a manslaughter conviction and a life lost over a domestic dispute. Sometimes the most shocking villain stories aren't fictional at all. Number 3, Roy Norris. Some crimes are so cruel, so methodical, and so deliberately sadistic that even seasoned investigators struggle to describe them. In the late 1970s, Southern California became the hunting ground for two men whose names would become permanently linked to some of the most disturbing crimes in American history: Roy Norris and his partner, Lawrence Bittaker. Together they became known as the Toolbox Killers. Roy Norris had a criminal history long before he met Bittaker. Born in 1948, Norris had a troubled childhood marked by abuse and instability. As a teenager and young adult, he committed sexual assaults and other crimes that resulted in prison time. It was during incarceration that he met Lawrence Bittaker in the mid-1970s. Both men shared violent sexual fantasies and a fascination with domination. Prison did not rehabilitate them. It gave them time to bond. When they were released, they reconnected. In 1979, they began planning. They acquired a light-colored GMC van and nicknamed it Murder Mac or the Scream. On the surface, it was just another vehicle on California highways. Inside, it became a mobile torture chamber. They lined the interior with materials to muffle sound. They stocked it with tools, pliers, ice picks, hammers, and other instruments that gave rise to their infamous label. Their method was chillingly simple. They cruised areas frequented by teenage girls and young women: beaches, bus stops, parking lots. They posed as friendly strangers offering rides. Some victims were tricked, others were forcibly abducted. Once inside the van, escape was nearly impossible. Between June and October 1979, Norris and Bittaker kidnapped, tortured, and murdered 5 young women: Lucinda Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jacqueline Gilliam, Shirley Ledford, and Lynette O'Connor. What sets these crimes apart is not just the number of victims, but the calculated cruelty. The victims were restrained inside the van. They were beaten, sexually assaulted, and tortured with the tools Norris and Bittaker had deliberately brought for that purpose. The violence was prolonged. It was intentional. This was not impulsive killing. It was premeditated sadism. In at least one case, they recorded the assault on audio tape. The existence of that recording horrified investigators and prosecutors. The tape captured the terror and suffering of 16-year-old Shirley Ledford during her final hours. It was later played in court as evidence, a decision that left courtroom observers shaken. Even hardened law enforcement officers reportedly found it difficult to endure. After killing their victims, Norris and Bittaker disposed of the bodies in remote areas, often in the mountains surrounding Los Angeles. Some remains were not immediately discovered, adding to the uncertainty and fear that gripped the region. The summer of 1979 became a period of escalating dread. Young women disappeared. Families waited for phone calls that never came. Law enforcement struggled to connect the cases at first, but patterns emerged: similar victim profiles, similar locations, similar timelines. The partnership between Norris and Bittaker was built on shared depravity. According to later testimony, they fed off each other's fantasies. Norris would later claim that Bittaker was the dominant force, the instigator. But the evidence showed active participation from both men. Norris restrained victims. He assaulted them. He helped transport and dispose of bodies. This was not the story of a reluctant accomplice trapped by fear. It was the story of two men who chose to act together. The crimes might have continued had it not been for a critical mistake. In October 1979, after the murder of Shirley Ledford, Norris began to panic. The brutality had escalated. The risk of capture was growing. Eventually, he confided in acquaintances about the crimes, which led to information reaching law enforcement. In November 1979, both men were arrested. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including physical evidence, witness accounts, and the infamous audio tape, Roy Norris chose to cooperate. In 1980, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and related charges. In exchange for his testimony against Bittaker, Norris received a sentence of 45 years to life, avoiding the death penalty. Lawrence Bittaker went to trial. The jury heard the evidence. They heard portions of the recording. In 1981, Bittaker was convicted and sentenced to death. He would remain on death row until his death in 2019. Norris, meanwhile, entered the California prison system with a life sentence. Parole hearings came and went. Each time, release was denied. The severity of the crimes ensured that he would never regain freedom. The label "toolbox killers" is chillingly literal. The tools were not symbolic. They were real, purchased, and packed with intent. The van was not a spontaneous location. It was prepared, modified, used repeatedly. The victims were not chosen randomly in a moment of rage. They were targeted based on vulnerability. What makes these crimes particularly disturbing is the deliberate recording of suffering. Most killers hide their acts. Norris and Bittaker documented them. The audio tape wasn't just evidence. It was a record of calculated cruelty. It demonstrated that the pain inflicted was not accidental or incidental. It was the objective. For the FBI and local law enforcement, the case became one of the most harrowing investigations of that era. The brutality forced agencies to confront the reality of serial sexual sadism operating in broad daylight on public roads in a city as sprawling as Los Angeles. The victims were teenagers and young women at the start of their lives. They had families, friends, futures. Their abductions were sudden, their suffering prolonged. The contrast between the ordinariness of a van ride and the horror waiting inside it makes the story even more haunting. Roy Norris spent decades behind bars, his name permanently linked to one of the darkest chapters in California criminal history. He died in prison in 2020. There is no cinematic myth here. No romanticized outlaw narrative. Only calculated cruelty carried out in a vehicle designed to silence screams. The Scream van drove through ordinary streets, past ordinary people, blending into traffic. No one looking at it from the outside would have known what was happening within its walls. That is the most terrifying part. Evil did not announce itself. It did not wear a mask. It offered a ride. And for 5 young women in 1979, that ride became the last journey they would ever take. Number 4, Hugo Pennell. Some men become infamous for what they do in a single moment. Others build their reputations over decades. Hugo Pennell became a legend inside California's prison system not because of one crime, but because of a lifetime of violence, defiance, and isolation that stretched across nearly half a century. Pennell entered prison in the 1960s with a robbery conviction. That sentence alone would not have made him extraordinary, but inside California's correctional system, he aligned himself with radical prison movements and became associated with one of the most explosive chapters in state prison history, the events surrounding the 1971 San Quentin uprising. He was one of the inmates later known as the San Quentin Six, a group charged in connection with the violent aftermath of an escape attempt at San Quentin State Prison. The incident left 2 guards and 3 inmates dead. The escape attempt was led by another prisoner, but the fallout led to sweeping prosecutions. Pennell was accused of participating in the violence that erupted inside the prison. The trial of the San Quentin Six lasted 16 months and became one of the longest criminal trials in California history at that time. The courtroom battles were chaotic, politically charged, and nationally covered. In the end, most of the defendants, including Pennell, were acquitted of the most serious charges related to the deaths. But acquittal did not mean release. Pennell was already serving time, and his behavior inside prison would ensure that he never returned to general population for long. By the early 1970s, Pennell had built a reputation as one of the most dangerous inmates in California custody. Officials described him as militant, fiercely loyal to prison revolutionary ideology, and violently resistant to authority. According to prison reports, he attacked correctional officers with improvised weapons, including razor blades concealed in his mouth or clothing. One of the most notorious allegations involved him slashing the throats of guards during altercations. Razor blades in prison are small, easily hidden, and lethally sharp. An attack with one is intimate and sudden. It requires proximity. It leaves little room for defense. Prison officials viewed Pennell as a constant threat. As a result, he was placed in solitary confinement. And he stayed there, year after year, decade after decade. California's security housing units are designed for inmates deemed too dangerous for general population. Isolation cells confine prisoners for up to 22 or 23 hours a day. Human contact is minimal. Movement is restricted. Meals are passed through slots in steel doors. The environment is controlled, sterile, and psychologically punishing. Pennell would spend approximately 45 years in some form of solitary confinement, an unofficial record in California. To understand the scale of that number, consider that 45 years is longer than many prison sentences for homicide. It is longer than some entire careers. It is nearly half a century in a concrete cell. Supporters of Pennell argued that his prolonged isolation was excessive, even inhumane. They described him as a political prisoner, targeted for his beliefs and associations. Prison officials countered that his record of violent assaults made him unmanageable in less restrictive settings. The truth sits in the tension between those narratives. Pennell was not a man with a minor disciplinary file. Reports documented multiple assaults on staff and inmates over the years. He was seen as unrepentant and combative. At the same time, 45 years in near-continuous isolation is a staggering measure of confinement, one that drew attention from prison reform advocates. In the 2010s, California began reevaluating its long-term solitary confinement policies. Legal challenges and public scrutiny led to changes in how inmates were classified and housed. After decades in isolation, Pennell was eventually transferred out of solitary confinement and into the general population at a different facility. For a man who had spent most of his adult life in a cell alone, that transition was enormous. But freedom within prison walls can be volatile. In August 2015, at California State Prison, Sacramento, violence erupted. Within hours of arriving in general population, Hugo Pennell was attacked by other inmates. He was stabbed multiple times and died from his injuries. He had survived decades of confinement. He had endured some of the harshest conditions the California prison system could impose. Yet once released from isolation into a yard filled with other prisoners, he lasted less than a day. Pennell's life story is one of extremes: extreme confinement, extreme violence, extreme reputation. To some inmates, he was a symbol of resistance, someone who refused to submit to authority, regardless of consequence. To correctional officers, he was the embodiment of institutional danger, a man who used razor blades as weapons and never fully abandoned violence. The image of him slashing at guards with concealed blades became part of prison lore. Whether viewed as legend or documented history, it reinforced his classification as a maximum threat. In an environment already saturated with danger, he stood out. Spending 45 years in solitary confinement changes a person. Studies on long-term isolation describe severe psychological effects: paranoia, depression, hallucinations, emotional blunting. Pennell endured those conditions for nearly half a century. Whether that hardened him further or fractured him internally is something only he truly knew. What is certain is that his name became synonymous with solitary confinement in California. He was cited in debates about prison reform. He was referenced in discussions about inmate radicalization and institutional control. He became both a cautionary tale and a rallying point, depending on who was speaking. But strip away the politics, the ideology, and the debate, and what remains is a man whose life was consumed by prison walls. He entered custody as a robber. He became part of one of the most infamous prison trials in state history. He allegedly attacked guards with razor blades, cementing his status as a threat. He spent 45 years in isolation. And when he finally stepped back into general population, he was stabbed to death within hours. Number 5, Sonika Shakur. In south-central Los Angeles during the late 1970s and 1980s, reputation was survival. Fear was currency. And violence was often the quickest way to earn both. Long before prison memoirs and public interviews, before transformation narratives and media attention, Sonika Shakur was known by a different name: Monster. He earned that name at 13 years old. According to his own accounts and those of others in the neighborhood, Shakur brutally beat a robbery target for nearly 20 minutes. The assault was so severe that the victim was left in a coma. In gang culture, especially among youth trying to establish credibility, extreme violence could become a rite of passage. That beating was not just an act of aggression, it was an announcement. It signaled that he was willing to cross lines others hesitated to approach. From that moment, the nickname stuck. Shakur became deeply embedded in the 8-tray gangster Crips, a prominent and feared subset of the larger Crips. The 8-tray gangster Crips were known for their territorial control and violent clashes, particularly during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles. Turf wars were constant. Retaliation was swift. The streets operated under their own code, separate from courts and law enforcement. Within that world, Shakur rose quickly. He described himself as a combat soldier for the set, someone who enforced territory, carried out retaliations, and embodied the gang's readiness for confrontation. In gang hierarchies, not everyone is on the front line. Some sell drugs, some manage logistics. Combat soldiers are different. They are the ones sent when a message must be delivered through force. Gunfire was common in the neighborhoods where he operated. Drive-by shootings became a defining feature of Los Angeles gang conflict during the 1980s. Young men armed with automatic weapons patrolled blocks like war zones. The line between adolescence and soldier blurred. Many gang members were barely teenagers, yet carried themselves with the hardened posture of veterans. Shakur embraced that identity fully. He was arrested multiple times for violent offenses, including shootings and robberies. By the early 1990s, he was convicted of attempted murder and assault with a firearm. The streets that had shaped him eventually funneled him into the California prison system. Prison, for many gang members, does not end affiliation. It intensifies it. Behind bars, alliances are formalized along racial and gang lines. Discipline is strict. Reputation follows you through the gates. Shakur entered custody already carrying the weight of his street name. Inside, he aligned with other Crip members and maintained his militant persona. Violence did not evaporate at sentencing. It shifted environments. California prisons in the late 20th century were saturated with gang politics. Inmates were expected to stand with their groups. Weakness could invite attack. Loyalty was tested constantly. But prison also introduced something different to Shakur: time. Extended incarceration forces reflection, whether welcomed or not. During his sentence, Shakur began to read extensively. He studied political theory, black nationalist thought, and revolutionary writings. Influenced by figures such as Malcolm X and other radical thinkers, he underwent an ideological shift. He legally changed his name from Cody Scott to Sanyika Shakur, distancing himself from Monster and aligning himself with a more politicized identity. The transformation was not immediate nor universally accepted. Critics questioned whether it was genuine or strategic. Supporters argued that growth inside prison is possible, even for those with deeply violent pasts. In 1993, Shakur published an autobiography titled Monster, the autobiography of an LA gang member. The book was raw, direct, and unapologetic about the violence of his youth. He did not soften the descriptions of shootings, beatings, and street warfare. He detailed the culture of initiation, the normalization of brutality, and the psychological conditioning that made extreme violence feel routine. The title alone ensured controversy. For some readers, the book was a warning, a first-hand account of how easily a child can be absorbed into gang life. For others, it risked mythologizing brutality, but it undeniably offered insight into the machinery of street violence from someone who had lived it. After serving time, Shakur was released and attempted to build a life outside the gang framework. He became involved in activism and community discussions about violence prevention, yet his relationship with the law did not completely end. He faced additional legal troubles over the years, including weapons charges, which complicated his post-prison narrative. The name Monster never fully detached from him. It is difficult for someone who earned notoriety through violence to completely escape that identity. At 13, when he beat a robbery target into a coma, he carved his nickname into the street's memory. That act of sustained brutality, 20 minutes of relentless assault, was not just a fight. It was a demonstration. It told older gang members that he could inflict damage without hesitation. In neighborhoods where fear could keep you alive, that reputation mattered. But it also set the trajectory for everything that followed. The 8 Trey gangster crips were not operating in isolation. They were part of a broader network of Los Angeles gang conflicts that defined an era. Homicide rates surged. Entire communities lived under the constant possibility of crossfire. Young men like Shakur became both products and drivers of that environment. What makes his story complex and unsettling is the duality. On one hand, there is the 13-year-old who nearly killed someone to prove himself. The armed combatant in gang wars. The convicted felon serving serious time for violent crimes. On the other hand, there is the incarcerated man who turned to books, who adopted a political identity, who wrote about his past with apparent reflection. Violence in adolescence leaves permanent marks on victims, on perpetrators, on communities. The victim of that 20-minute beating carried scars and trauma. Shakur carried a name that followed him for decades. Unlike some of the other figures in this series, Shakur's life did not end in prison or on death row. His narrative includes evolution. Whether that evolution redeems anything is a question viewers and readers answer differently. What cannot be erased is the beginning. A 13-year-old boy beating a man into unconsciousness for nearly half an hour. A teenager stepping fully into a gang identity defined by retaliation and street warfare. A young adult moving through a city where gunshots were punctuation marks in daily life. The name Monster was not given lightly. It was earned in violence. Number 6, Arturo Castellanos. Arturo Castellanos was not your typical criminal figure. He wasn't a street shooter or a prison riot instigator grabbing headlines for an escape attempt or a riot. What made Arturo Castellanos one of the most chilling figures in modern gang history is his ability to control violence, extortion, and murder from behind concrete walls and steel doors. From a security housing unit at Pelican Bay State Prison, one of the harshest solitary confinement facilities in the United States. The horror of Castellanos isn't simply that he was a gangster, it's that he became a feared, almost ghostly boss whose orders reverberated through the streets of South Los Angeles long after he was locked away. Castellanos was a member of the Mexican Mafia, the notorious prison-based gang that exerts influence over a network of street gangs known as Cerreos. Mexican Mafia members are notoriously disciplined, ruthless, and feared by both rival gangs and the communities caught in the crossfire of their criminal enterprises. One of the most powerful street-level affiliates of this network is Florencia 13, a gang rooted in the Florence Firestone district of Los Angeles. Florencia 13 has been linked to extortion, drug trafficking, shootings, homicides, and terrorizing entire neighborhoods. But what makes Castellanos uniquely terrifying is how he orchestrated and shaped this violence from a prison cell hundreds of miles away. Locked up since 1979 for murder, Castellanos was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Like many dangerous members of organized crime, he was placed in solitary confinement, a realm where human contact is minimal, movement restricted, and even sunlight a rare memory. Normally, this sort of isolation is designed to break a person's influence and diminish their ability to communicate. But Castellanos managed to turn his cell into a headquarters. Through handwritten letters smuggled out by visitors and intermediaries, he maintained a structured chain of command over Florencia 13 members on the streets. Prosecutors in federal racketeering cases described how Castellanos issued written reglas, or rules, many of which were written in cramped handwriting taped to furniture found by police. These directives governed everything from how local drug sales were organized and taxed, to how disputes were settled and how suspected informants, known in gang slang as rats or 25 debriefers, were to be dealt with. Castellanos' rules weren't just strategic, they were enforced with violence. They dictated which gangs would control drug territory, who would collect extortion payments, and who would be targeted if they stepped out of line. Law enforcement found that gangs whose members had joined the Mexican Mafia were less likely to be extorted or violently green-lighted by other factions, because Castellanos' influence protected them and punished those who resisted. In essence, Castellanos wasn't merely giving orders, he was setting up a brutal economic and terror network that coordinated extortion, drugs, and murder in neighborhoods where entire blocks lived under the threat of gang enforcement. This was power exercised without ever leaving a concrete cell, never stepping foot on the street, never facing face-to-face confrontation with rivals or victims. Yet Castellanos' influence was real enough that federal indictments in the 2000s explicitly named him as an unindicted co-conspirator in operations that spanned narcotics, firearms, extortion, and violent crime. Prosecutors alleged that senior gang figures on the street took orders from him, orders initiated from a solitary cell at Pelican Bay, through messengers and coded communication. What makes Castellanos' story truly horrifying is the calculated way in which he merged bureaucracy with brutality. His rules were not vague threats. They were structured organizational commands, complete with hierarchies and enforcement protocols. According to law enforcement testimony, gang cliques under Florencia 13 were instructed to elect leaders, hold regular meetings, and follow protocols for managing internal disputes. If gang members failed to comply, or if suspected traitors emerged, Castellanos' directives left no doubt that violence was the prescribed response. Witness accounts and seized documents paint a picture of a ghostly boss whose reach stretched far beyond prison walls, shaping who lived and died in Los Angeles neighborhoods. And the terror extended beyond just gang members. In neighborhoods, the rules issued under Castellanos' name affected civilians, drug dealers forced to pay taxes, young men coerced into gang affiliation, and residents living under the constant shadow of retaliatory shootings. In one instance documented in indictments, orders allegedly led to attacks against rival gangs that erupted into broader violence in the community, with victims who had no gang affiliation caught in the crossfire. Castellanos' ability to hold this kind of sway from confinement raised alarm among law enforcement. They saw how a solitary inmate could effectively run a criminal empire by empowering shot callers on the streets, the gang leaders who physically carried out violence, extortion, and recruitment. Castellanos would designate who became these shot callers, and in doing so, he became the unseen arbiter of life and death across entire city blocks. The psychology behind his influence is as terrifying as the mechanics. Castellanos was isolated, yet his written words carried authority. Gang members who had never seen him in person or seen him only once before imprisonment treated his directives as law. In gangs where loyalty and fear are intertwined, fear of defiance is what gives orders power. Castellanos didn't need to physically enforce rules. The threat of reprisal did that for him. This is the kind of psychological dominion that transforms a gang from a street crew into a terror network. It's also a disturbing example of how criminal networks can adapt to repression. Isolation was supposed to sever communication, to render a leader impotent. In Castellanos' case, it did not. Instead, it turned his captivity into a force multiplier. His isolation space became a paradoxical platform for control, where the fewer connections he had to the outside world, the more fearsome his mystique became to his followers. The horror of Castellanos' influence is not measured in the physical distance between his cell and South Los Angeles, it's in the lives shattered by decisions that originated in that cell. Parents waking up to news of shootings, young men indicted for murder because they followed orders from afar, civilians caught in gang crossfire. These were the real-world consequences of a system where a once-violent individual maintained fealty and obedience to his commands even while locked away. Number 7. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was already one of the most notorious criminals in American history long before he ever set foot in Pelican Bay State Prison. By the time he was transferred there in the late 1990s, he had spent decades behind bars for orchestrating one of the most infamous murder sprees of the 20th century, the 1969 killings carried out by members of what became known as the Manson family. His name had become synonymous with manipulation, psychological domination, and ritualistic violence. But even after nearly 30 years in prison, Manson proved that incarceration did not extinguish his appetite for control. In the late 1990s, prison officials charged Manson with conspiracy to distribute drugs while he was incarcerated at another California facility. That accusation led to his transfer to the Security Housing Unit, better known as the SHU, at Pelican Bay, where he would spend approximately 14 months in extreme isolation. For a man whose entire criminal legacy revolved around influencing others to commit violence on his behalf, solitary confinement was a calculated move by authorities. The SHU is designed to cut communication to the bare minimum. Inmates are confined to small concrete cells for 22 to 23 hours a day. Human contact is scarce. Every movement is monitored. Every interaction filtered. It is a place meant to suffocate influence, and influence was Manson's weapon. To understand why his time in Pelican Bay mattered, you have to understand what he had already done. In 1969, Manson directed his followers to commit a series of brutal murders in Los Angeles. Among the victims was actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant at the time. She and 4 others were slaughtered inside her home. The following night, another couple, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, were stabbed to death in their residence. The killings were not random explosions of violence, they were calculated. Theatrical acts meant to ignite what Manson called helter-skelter, a delusional race war he believed would engulf America. He did not personally stab most of the victims. That was the horror. He convinced others to do it for him. Through a mix of pseudo-spiritual rhetoric, apocalyptic prophecy, LSD-fueled manipulation, and psychological domination, Manson transformed vulnerable young people into instruments of slaughter. He stripped them of identity, renamed them, isolated them from families, and fed them a narrative in which murder became a revolutionary act. The crime scenes were grotesque. Victims were stabbed dozens of times. Messages were written in blood. The brutality was intimate and prolonged. The suffering was deliberate. Manson was sentenced to death in 1971, but when California temporarily abolished the death penalty, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He would never leave prison alive. Over the decades, he became a dark cultural symbol, part murderer, part cult icon, part manipulative philosopher of chaos. Even behind bars, he received fan mail, interviews, and, disturbingly, admirers who saw him as a misunderstood figure rather than a calculating architect of terror. That ongoing influence is precisely what made prison authorities wary. By the 1990s, Manson was an aging inmate, but age had not erased his ability to attract followers. Prison officials accused him of conspiring to distribute drugs within the prison system, suggesting that he was still capable of orchestrating schemes through intermediaries. Whether driven by profit, power, or simple defiance, the charge reinforced a consistent pattern. Manson sought control wherever he was placed. And control inside prison can be just as dangerous as control outside. When he was moved to the Pelican Bay SHU, he entered one of the most restrictive environments in the American correctional system. The SHU is a world of cement and steel. Cells measure roughly 8 by 10 feet. There are no communal yards, no group programs, no shared meals. Exercise takes place alone in small concrete enclosures. Communication is tightly monitored. For an individual who built his identity on manipulating others, isolation is a unique form of punishment. It removes the audience. Yet even in isolation, Manson remained a symbol. The haunting aspect of his time in Pelican Bay is not dramatic violence within the prison walls. It is the persistence of his notoriety. Decades after the murders, the wounds he inflicted on families and the broader culture had not healed. Survivors and relatives of the victims continued to relive the horror at every parole hearing, forced to recount how their loved ones were butchered under Manson's command. The brutality of those 1969 nights did not fade with time. It remained raw. Manson's presence in the SHU underscored a grim reality. Some criminals do not lose their capacity for influence simply because they are caged. The system had to place him in near total isolation to mitigate the risk of further manipulation. That fact alone is chilling. It suggests that even stripped of physical freedom, even aged and confined, he retained enough psychological sway to concern authorities. His crimes were not crimes of impulse. They were crimes of indoctrination. He exploited vulnerability, rewired loyalty, and turned human beings into executioners. The Tate LaBianca murders were carried out with knives, ropes, and guns. But the true weapon was persuasion. That kind of weapon does not rust. When Manson died in 2017 at the age of 83, he had spent nearly half a century behind bars. He never expressed genuine remorse. He often deflected blame, portraying himself as a product of society or minimizing his responsibility by claiming he never physically killed anyone. But leadership in murder does not require holding the knife. It requires commanding the hand that does. His 14 months in the Pelican Bay SHU represent a final chapter in a life defined by manipulation. Concrete walls replaced desert communes. Guards replaced disciples. Silence replaced sermons. Yet the shadow of what he orchestrated never left him. The horror of Charles Manson is not just the blood spilled in Los Angeles in 1969. It is the demonstration of how charisma twisted into fanaticism can override conscience. It is the proof that psychological domination can be more destructive than brute force. And it is the unsettling realization that even in a concrete box in Northern California, the name Manson still carried enough weight to demand isolation. Some criminals are remembered for what they did with their own hands. Manson is remembered for what he convinced others to do with theirs.